Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Well, it is great to be here in person. Great to see you all. If I say anything out of school or out of turn, it's been a couple years since I've really been active in in-person events. I don't know how long those excuses go for us, but I have no doubt this is going to be a riveting conversation. So great to be here in person and to have Congressman Khanna with us, someone who's been a great leader in the private sector, someone who's had a very impressive career prior to elected service, and obviously you're a part of such important dialogues and conversations and policies going on right now in DC. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Ahmad, thank you for moderating this. You're doing a fabulous job leading the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, about a year and a half, and you've already had a major impact on our region. And thank you to the Commonwealth Club. It's an honor, really, to be here.
Well, thank you, Ro, and we are thrilled to be here. With that, I will jump right in. We want to focus on the book, Dignity in the Digital Age. And my first question is why you wrote the book. And I also want to add that the title, dignity, is a heavy word. It's a multi-layered word. Speak to us about the title as well.
The market cap in my district and the surrounding areas, as you know, Ahmad, is $11 trillion. Apple, Google, Intel, Yahoo, Cisco, LinkedIn. Put that in perspective, whether or not the market cap is analogous to GDP, but the entire GDP of Russia is $1.6 trillion, $11 trillion. And as wealth has piled up in places like Silicon Valley and New York, Austin, large parts of the country have been totally left out of globalization. They've seen jobs leave. They've seen towns decimated. They've had to have kids buy one-way tickets out. And the central question that I was asking in the book and exploring is how do we create economic opportunity for nearly half the country that has been left out of the opportunities for wealth generation and economic security in a modern economy. And dignity is about having the opportunity to contribute, both as an economic actor and as a citizen. And one of the arguments I make is people feel that they don't often have that chance in a digital age. And how do we make sure that it's not just redistribution post-production, but actually giving people, empowering people to succeed in a new economy?
Well, I think when you talk about the digital age, you talk about empowering people to succeed. One thing I found very interesting, you had a Milken Institute study that talked about essentially technology, jobs, economic growth beyond Silicon Valley, right? I don't see Silicon Valley as a zero-sum economy or a zero-sum game, although, of course, my interests are very parochial in that I want to see our region thrive and succeed. How do you begin to address that concern? You have your district, you obviously want to see the 17th district thrive and succeed, but your book also speaks to taking technology jobs and innovation and economic prosperity to rural areas, nowhere near your district. Is that incongruent? Are you trying to do both? Can you speak to that?
I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I mean, obviously we want innovation, job creation in Silicon Valley in the 17th district. But I think one of the big challenges in our district is making sure we have more housing so that you don't have gentrification, so people can afford to come here and live here, making sure that the service workers around the tech economy are paid a fair wage. So you don't have people in San Jose that have 60% of their income going to rent. So we have our own challenges in Silicon Valley. Yes, job creation is one of them and remaining innovative, but also basic equity in the digital ecosystem that I know Silicon Valley Leadership Group and others are focused on. But that doesn't mean that it's okay for all of the economic growth, innovation to be in a few areas in the country. One of the studies I cite that I think Brookings or the Rob Atkinson's group, the Technology Foundation, did is say that there are 5 cities in this country that have about 90% of the digital service jobs. That's not sustainable. We're going to have 25 million digital jobs by 2025. And those opportunities need to be distributed so you don't have to leave your hometown to have good opportunities. And these jobs aren't, by the way, coding at Google or coding at Facebook. They're in manufacturing, they're in retail, they're in healthcare. Almost every business, it's a cliche, is going to have a technology component. What are we doing in places around the country so that young people there have the same opportunities as young people growing up and going to Homestead High School or Cupertino High School? That's the thesis of the book, not one to diminish Silicon Valley, but one to say, how do we get other parts of the country participating in some of that opportunity?
So you would say as Silicon Valley thrives, our companies scale, we continue to innovate, our economies become more equitable and continue to grow, so do opportunities for rural communities less connected to Silicon Valley to benefit from that largesse, or are they separate issues?
Well, I think we have to be intentional. And several of the companies, I'm going to give you a few pilot projects. I was just in Claflin, a HBCU in South Carolina, a brilliant school. And Zoom took the initiative to make an investment in the curriculum there. And I met this really bright young woman who's going to stay in South Carolina, and she has almost a 6-figure job working at Zoom. Now, that's a win-win. That's a win for Zoom in our area. It's a win for the HBCU. It's looking at beyond the horizon of where there's talent. We don't have a person or community to write off in a globally competitive environment. Similarly, in rural communities, Google is working with community colleges to set up a curriculum where you need a 9-month credential to then be able to get a good paying job. And that helps these companies and it helps those communities. But we have to be intentional in looking at how do we develop that talent, how do we have a public-private partnership, how do we have the empowerment economically of areas that have had job loss, and how do we bring also production back in this country. I think the 2 things from COVID that I think everyone sort of realizes is one, every person needs to be participating in some way in digital life and the digital economy. And that these things, people are now on Zoom. They saw the importance of the digital age. So much of Silicon Valley, 40% appreciation in wealth with the increasing digitalization of the economy. So people get it, that they want young people, they want folks in their communities to have these opportunities. Second thing I think we learned is we need to produce more things in America. There's supply chain issues. The fact that we couldn't produce masks was an issue. We shouldn't just have offshored all of our production. So we have an opportunity, I think, post-COVID for the economic revitalization of places that have been left out over the last 30, 40 years from economic prosperity. And that, to me, is critical to stitch our country back together.
I think that's very well said. And one thought I had, and certainly there are multiple instances in your book, where I'm left wondering, about Roe as a evangelist for Silicon Valley, or Roe as someone who, as a representative, obviously is trying to take this technology and innovation and economy to all pockets of the country where folks are less fortunate. My thesis is that I believe we're entering a new era of corporate citizenship, where our leading technology companies can actually benefit and realize greater revenue and economic success from being better corporate actors. You mentioned Zoom and Eric Yuan, all the wonderful work he's done with HBCUs around keeping us going through COVID, which wouldn't be possible without that technology. Do you fundamentally believe that there is an opportunity for our business leaders in Silicon Valley to have this positive impact? Is that where you believe the future is going, or do you see it going potentially elsewhere?
I completely agree with you. One of the speeches I'm most inspired by is Bobby Kennedy in 1964. He talks about Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's a Brooklyn community in New York. And Kennedy talks about how are we going to have economic redevelopment in that community. And he helps set up the economic redevelopment. And he says it's not just going to be the federal government or the state government. It's going to be government, but it's going to be community leaders, and it's going to be the private sector. And working together, we're going to create economic opportunity. We need to have that kind of a mission in this country if we want to have economic revitalization. That means calling on business leaders to think about their responsibility in helping see talent, in helping invest in talent, and looking in non-conventional places, partnering with federal investment, partnering with local community leaders. This can be a mission that involves all Americans and asks Americans to help rebuild the country. So it's not just, okay, here are a bunch of politicians saying, go do this. So I believe technology companies can be and will be part of the solution. You know, every congressman wants their line added into the State of the Union. Mine didn't make it in, but I said President Biden should call on the country to say by 2025, we're going to have 1 million Black and Latino Americans having digital jobs and 1 million rural Americans having digital jobs, and then convene HBCUs, land-grant universities, tech leaders to help make that happen. A lot of that can happen just through leadership by civic leaders, government leaders, and the private sector working together.
And when you talk about the rural communities, because that's a thread throughout the book, is it about assets that aren't being fully utilized? Can you speak to how you became very engaged around helping those communities?
Well, I don't view it as helping as much as I view it as partnering, because I got invited to Appalachia and by Hal Rogers. I thought, you know, you're going to have this Indian American guy go from this liberal Bay Area district down to Trump country talking about technology. And I went to Paintsville, Kentucky, and they know everything about technology. They're saying that they want to diversify their economy. They want money coming in, not just going out. They understand we're having a digital transformation. They want these opportunities. So what you get is extraordinary work ethic, ambition, hunger to participate. And then, by the way, these jobs are not that different than the jobs some of them have done. I start the book writing about Alex Hughes. He says, we know how to make things. Well, Alex Hughes is making refrigerators today. He's just making refrigerators with smart appliances and smart electronics. And that is a skill that he learned in a 9-month course in Appalachia that Interapt and the federal government helped support. So the point is that you can get extraordinary talent. I'd rather those jobs be in Appalachia than in China or elsewhere, and that it's taking advantage of talent. Often the cost of living differential makes it in the company's interest to cultivate that talent in places where people are. And you don't want to uproot people from the community. You know, one of the things, I was just in Galesburg. I've gotten to travel a fair amount this last week. Ever since I wrote the book, some people have invited me and just having conversations. And I met with this group of folks who were at the Maytag plant in Galesburg, Illinois. And their story was so sad, because in 2004, when the plant went, they said it didn't just destroy our jobs, it destroyed our community, our family. They used to celebrate Christmas together. They knew uncles and aunts and grandparents in that plant. Everyone knew each other. It was a family. And they said President Obama spoke about it famously in the 2004 keynote speech, but nothing has changed in our community. The jobs haven't come back. Our kids are still leaving. We as a country have to focus on places like Galesburg, Illinois, places like the west side of Chicago, places like Dayton, Ohio, white and black, Latino, that have faced deindustrialization, that have not been winners in globalization, that have been the victims, I would argue, of failed policy for the last 40 years, not intentionally failed, but policies that have not taken sufficient account of place. And we owe it to them to have an intentional plan bringing business, government, civic sector together for economic revitalization.
Why now? Was this an inflection point coming out of COVID, you know, something potentially positive, seeing an opportunity, or was your motivation for writing this book now that you saw, as you mentioned, 40 years of failed policies that you might be trying to address? Talk about the timing.
Well, I thought COVID was a unique moment, because suddenly everyone went on remote work. There was a recognition that you didn't just have to have everything agglomerated in Silicon Valley. For the longest time, people said everything has to be in these clusters. And this was a forced experiment that seemed to work, that people could be rooted in their community and still contribute. And so that thought said, well, maybe this gives us some momentum to have economic revitalization in places that have been left out, and to be intentional about that. And then technology is something now that everyone realized. They realized the consequences of the digital divide if their kids couldn't go on Zoom or do their homework. They realized the consequences of it in terms of the divide of those who could work remotely and those who were doing physical labor and exposing themselves to a higher risk of COVID. One of the points I make in the book is 2/3 of jobs in this country are not digital jobs or behind a laptop. They are physical jobs. And the disparity there is also stark. You know, there's something wrong in our society where, and I, don't say this to disparage Amazon, but where you can make trillions of dollars, and I buy from Amazon all the time, and you can benefit if you're a executive there, software engineer there, consumer there, maybe one of the richest companies ever in human history. But then if you're working at the warehouse, you say, well, I'm only making 15, 16 bucks, and my life is worse off than the 30 bucks my father made or mother made at a factory plant. And by the way, now instead of that mean boss, I've got an algorithm as a boss that's even worse. Where is the dignity for me? And I think we are not sufficiently aware, and one of the reasons we have such resentment, polarization, anger in this country is not out of an intentional sort of cruelty of those who have won in globalization, but a neglect, a drift, and there hasn't been sufficient attention paid to those who have not won. And I don't think this is just an American phenomenon. Same thing in England, where you have the south of England prospering, north of England having deindustrialization. Same thing in Belgium. I think globally, we have the winners and losers of globalization, and we have to figure out what do we do so that disparity doesn't exist.
Well, you mentioned Amazon as one company, and I've heard you speak about this. When you talk about polling, if you were to poll an approval rating of Amazon versus Congress and your colleagues, I think the latest numbers I've seen, it's in the 70s, right, for Amazon, and 17, 18%, right, for Congress. Why is that? Does that contradict with what you just shared, or are they completely separate issues when you look at trust and a benevolent reputation?
Well, when's the last time Congress ever sent you something to your doorstep within 24 hours? I mean, I don't know, maybe right
maybe
after
a
the
bill.
stimulus check
Yeah,
or something, you could poll right then. But the point is that, like I said, I use Amazon. Most people use Amazon. It's a convenient service. There's no doubt it was an extraordinary innovation in logistics, in providing products at a cheap price, in helping some of the small businesses expand their markets. But I mean, obviously there are issues with it and antitrust to make sure they don't discriminate against sellers. But the point is, when people are asked, okay, do you approve of Amazon? They think, well, has Amazon made my life better or not? And many people, it's made their life better. I don't think they're thinking, well, what happened to towns that face deindustrialization and are now working in warehouses at Amazon? And maybe they don't even blame Amazon for that, right? Maybe the problem is not just Amazon, but it's federal policy, that we still have a $7.25 minimum wage law, that we don't have collective bargaining, that we don't have the ability to raise pay for the service sector. So, I mean, part of it could be Amazon, part of it could just be a failure of policy. But what it has led to is a whole generation of working class Americans who don't just believe, but are factually accurate in thinking that their life is worse off than their parents. And that contradicts the American dream. And we have to figure out how we address that. And one of the points I make in the book is you can't talk about dignity in the digital age if the working class and those who are not behind computers are totally left out.
Well, we talk about economics and economic output, economic impacts, but you also write about civic fabric, our social institutions. Maybe, you're talking about people getting along and living together well. And those seem to be issues that aren't really, I would say, correlated, or certainly not happening if you look at the political system, or if you just look at those towns that you mentioned. Right? On the one hand, of course, economic opportunity has eluded many of these communities, and those are issues that we need to address. But on the same front, when you talk about social fabric, I don't know if do you get the sense maybe when you have a congressman from Tennessee who might have a polar opposite opinion from yours on social issues and so many other items. Is there a willingness to work together and build a social fabric, or is it purely economic? What can we do to improve jobs and further interests today?
Well, I think the two are connected. Obviously, there are deep divisions in this country on so many issues, on reproductive rights, on LGBTQ plus equality, on racial justice, on voting rights, on issues of deep fundamental importance in what we believe is a just society, issues that have deeper meaning than just economics. But that said, the economics may be a way that we can find some common ground. There is an emerging consensus in this country that we shouldn't have just let our production go offshore, millions of jobs that left when going to China. There's an emerging consensus that we ought to be investing in leading industries of the future in technology to create those jobs in the United States, across the United States. That's why the Competes Act, which I led with Senator Schumer and Todd Young, Indiana Senator, and Mike Gallagher, Representative Republican from Wisconsin, passed the Senate with 69 votes, including Mitch McConnell, and passed the House, and is one of the few things that hopefully, I'm on the conference committee, will get to the president's desk. So if you have a message of we've got to invest in the reindustrialization of America, we've got to invest in creating high-paying jobs, we've got to do this to make sure we lead the 21st century, I think that is a message that can cut across some of the ideological, geographical, racial divisions in this country. Is it sufficient? No. Is it a start? Yes.
Because my take, going back to the first question, is that for you and your thesis, dignity is beyond economic. It's about respect in perhaps another definition. And I think that is a real challenge when we're trying, you talk about building this civic fabric, this social fabric, and we have such polarization. Are you hopeful that we can see, whether it be through Competes or other opportunities to work together, we can see more bipartisan progress? Or is that Pollyannish?
Well, I think it depends on how we can see better understanding as Americans. If you were to replace the entire Congress and Senate today and have people reelected from their constituencies, I think it would be just as polarized. The problem isn't that the senators and congresspeople are polarized, it's that the actual constituencies are polarized. So how do we create more mutual understanding? How do we create more joint work? You know, that's one of the things that I've talked about in this book. When manufacturing did well, the coal towns did well, the railroad towns did well. When Silicon Valley does well, it's not necessarily the case that Youngstown, Ohio, or Orangeburg, South Carolina does well. How do we create more connectivity in a digital economy so that joint work leads to joint prosperity, so that people are working with each other outside the silos? And that can all help in creating more understanding. But at the root of it, of course, is figuring out how we talk with respect to each other as Americans. Again, respect, figuring out how we build a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that has sufficient commonality and respect for our history and in understanding, though, of our differences and respect for that. That's not easy. No, if it were easy, someone else would have done it. No one has done it in the history of the world. I say this, and I always get criticized on Twitter from the Canadians, and they take real offense that I'm saying America is going to be the first multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in the world. And I don't mean offense to the Canadians, but they're 80-some% white. I mean, we're 60% white, non-Hispanic. When my parents came to the country in the 60s, post the 1965 Immigration Act, immigration to this country was 90% European. It's today 15% European. What we're trying to do in this country is very, very difficult. And I think that's partly what explains some of the polarization in the country.
Well, shifting gears, social media, which I thought was a fascinating topic that you touch on in the book. You wrote about a kind of PBS for social media. Can you speak to that and share with the audience what you mean? That seems to me as pretty futuristic and hard to do, and I'd love to learn more about the idea.
Sure. I mean, the idea is that when we have a town hall forum like this, you have reasonable rules, reasonable time, place restrictions. People can't just come yell and Well, we'll see what the Commonwealth Club allows, but they probably can't just insult me gratuitously in the way that they could on social media. So the point is, social media has its place. Anger has its place. Resentment has its place. You know, when George Floyd happened, I was glad that there were forums on Facebook and Twitter where people were expressing anger and frustration and not just politeness. But the point is, not all conversation has to be that way. There can be spaces for conversation that emulate the town hall, the cornerstone of American democracy. And so I say, you know, local communities like you have Nextdoor could create spaces for that type of conversation. Facebook could create that type of forum for every member of Congress. Have a town hall on Facebook, but you have certain rules, just like you would in a town hall in the in a physical space. How do we create digital institutions that emulate the best of the public sphere in the physical world? And that's something I think we have to do a lot of work on. One of the things I make points I make in the book is after the printing press, there was 100 years of war. Erasmus, who was the champion of the printing press, turns out to be a huge critic because he says all these pamphlets that are being published are blatant lies and they're leading to violence. And it wasn't by accident that the printing press turns out to be this thing that we celebrate. It was humanity working for 100 years to build the institutions of liberal democracy that allow the printing press to be seen as now a force for good. Unless you're in some very few states that want to ban books. But the point is that we have to do the same thing with digital media. We have to do the same thing. We have to intentionally create institutions that allow the technology to be used for the public good and public deliberation. And my vision of it is to have a messy public sphere where you have things like PBS or local community forums, but then you also have places like Facebook and Twitter. It's heavily influenced by one of the great philosophers who I was honored blurbs the book, Jürgen Habermas, who writes about ideal speech conditions as leading to legitimate policy and truth. But for those who read Habermas's later work, in Facts and Norms, he understands that that ideal is not possible in a messy democracy, but what we need to do is create institutions that approximate that ideal while having many discursive spaces. And that's the vision of what I think we ought to be doing in the digital sphere.
And in that digital sphere, you see an opportunity to improve humanity. I mean, when you're talking about this civic fabric and trying to weave that better, is that an example of where technology can be an asset to do so?
Yes, and it already has been, right, in some ways. I mean, think about the situation in Ukraine. I would argue that that's been a place where the social media has been a very positive force. I mean,
crypto and digital assets.
And the DAO that Zelensky has set up with cryptocurrency, allowing him to get money to people who need it. The fact that he's been able to tell his story online and be able to show the bravery and courage of the Ukrainian resistance. So I would argue that post-George Floyd, social media was a very positive force. The Black Lives Matter movement, it was positive. With the Me Too movement, it was positive. So these technologies have positive influences, but they also have very destructive influences, such as the fact that teenagers on Instagram want to often have suicidal thoughts because of what they're seeing, and no one is doing anything about it. Or the fact that QAnon's growth was on social media because they were directly targeted by these companies. And I guess my view is a balanced view. It is to say that technology can be at its best empowering to give voice to people who ordinarily don't have it. You don't have to be a member of Congress to say the interesting things. In fact, there are thousands of young people who are going to have much more viral posts than anything I'll say today. That's a democratizing impact. But it also can be dangerous in its misinformation, in the incitement to violence, in the incitement, I would argue, of January 6th. So how do we have well-crafted rules that shape a digital sphere that allows for the benefits of technology without the negatives? That's our challenge.
If you look at January 6th, I mean, I worked on the Hill. I watched that with complete and utter shock. I have an understanding of how well trained the Capitol Police are. In my mind, and I think for a lot of Black Americans, a lot of people of color, there's a racial element that you're very honest with yourself, and you see that, and you ask yourself if they look different, would the situation have maybe not escalated, or would people have been treated very differently? And it makes you think not so much about technological tools, but about what's being fomented in terms of racism, in terms of conditions in some of these marginalized communities that have helped elect people that might look the other way with decisions like that being made. Now, that's not a technology issue per se. It's an issue that's very deep and multi-layered. What are your views, or what do you think when you look at the root causes of January 6th or that type of foment and incitement? Can technology help solve that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to say that there are deeper issues involved, and that is, how do we inspire people to believe in a multiracial, multi-ethnic America? That to the extent that people believe in American exceptionalism, I would argue that that's the core essence of the American project that is exceptional, as Frederick Douglass in Composite Nation articulates, that we are going to be a nation of all nations. And there are people who resist that vision. And there are people who are uncomfortable with that vision. I believe that there are a small minority of Americans, but I think that their voices are obviously ones that have to be confronted, and that we have to provide an alternative on that. And that's an issue that I don't think technology itself can solve. It's a question of who we are as Americans. And then there are the questions of the economic dislocation, because I don't think that's a direct link to racism, but it can create the conditions for racism when you have economic dislocation and a lack of economic opportunity. But technology, I think, can make things slightly better or slightly worse. In January 6th, they made things worse. I mean, you had basically the plotting online on some of these platforms where people were talking about assassinating the vice president, then Pence, and these social media companies didn't report it, and they didn't have any obligation under Section 232 to report it. Well, that's a problem with the law. We shouldn't allow the incitement of violence on these platforms. That's not even under Brandenburg. So technology isn't going to magically make us a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, but technology, the distributing technological opportunity economically and having better public forums can help in that process as opposed to hinder that process.
Well, I appreciate you sharing the nuance here and knowing that leaders in DC see the conditions on the ground. You know, you often hear people focusing on the technology companies, often on the other side of the aisle, instead of focusing on the conditions and actions that we saw, which I think is very unfortunate. But maybe turning to that political sphere and progressive capitalism, how do you define a progressive capitalist?
Progressive capitalist is someone who believes in innovation, in entrepreneurship, in the value of markets. You believe that, you know, the United States Congress probably shouldn't be the board of directors of Apple Computers. You wouldn't have innovation if 435 members of Congress, given our technological knowledge, had to approve every decision. But you believe that there ought to be state intervention and regulation, that it's not okay for all the wealth to just be accumulating in a few places with a few people, and for the state to just say, well, that's the market, tough. That for communities to be destroyed and people to say, well, that's the market, tough. For people to lack health care and education, and folks to say, well, that's tough. They were born to the wrong parents, to the wrong family. That there has to be the role of the state in shaping markets in ways so that markets ultimately serve the common good. And it's a society, a democratic society, that defines markets, that defines the appropriate regulation, that defines the appropriate role for the state. And my criticism of neoliberalism was it was this absolute faith in the market with a very limited role for the state. And I think that there is a role for the state, particularly on healthcare, on education, on place-based policy.
Well, we have touched on a lot, and as you can see, I've got this list of questions that have come in from folks in the audience and online.
Great, active audience.
So I'm going to do my best to try and touch on as many of these questions and continue this dialogue, which I find fascinating. I hope folks in the audience do
See how
as well.
regulated the Commonwealth Club is? They don't even let folks stand up and
Well,
go on.
when you hear this question, the regulatory concerns might go away. It's, your vision requires major collaboration and drive at the national level. This person says, with a weak president and a dysfunctional Congress, how will this happen?
Well, I support the president. I think the president's been dealt a very tough hand. He assumed office with 40% of the country not thinking he's a legitimate president. I'm not sure in our history when that's happened. I mean, even Lincoln, I think, was recognized as the legitimate president. So that's a very unusual circumstance. He was elected in the midst of a pandemic, and then we had the Delta variant and Omicron variant. You've had Russia invade a sovereign country. So, you know, the president, I think, is doing his best under very difficult circumstances for the country. But I take the basic premise of the question, which is to do the types of things I'm talking about requires an energetic national vision, a sense of national purpose, a sense of national mobilization. When we have done it as a country, it has been FDR inspiring the country to respond to World War II. It has been Lincoln inspiring the country with the Land Grant or Homestead Act. It has been Kennedy inspiring us to get to the moon. And how we create that sense of national purpose, national urgency that can unify Americans is a challenge. And without that, you're not going to get the momentum in Congress to be able to do it. I would argue that the hollowing out of the middle class, the move away of production is something that Americans now see, that this is a national purpose, and the fact that Americans want to lead. They don't want that lead to go to China or someone else. That can be the beginnings of constructing a vision of national purpose that inspires Americans. But without that, I agree with the questioner that it's very, very difficult to get something done. And I would argue the reason it's so difficult is we haven't had that clarity of national purpose for a while in this country. Arguably, President Bush could have done it after 9/11, but there are unique moments where you have that opportunity as a leader to do that.
Another question for you. How are you received in conservative areas? This is from YouTube.
Well, I'm received very well because I'm relatively unknown. As you know, I have the benefit of not having had, you know, as, for example, our vice president, who I respect from our state, every day there are 25 negative media articles about her. And so when you have that, it's very hard to break through. One of my advantages, people don't know much about me. So when they meet me, they're more open-minded. The challenge is, how do you do that in a media environment once you start getting painted a certain way by the media? And that, I think, makes it harder. In an ironic sense, the higher one's profile is, the harder it is to break through and create those authentic relationships.
Well, when you speak about authentic relationships, I mean, I have been fortunate to witness how effective you are in DC, how effective your staff is. I think you honestly make a concerted effort to work with folks on the other side of the aisle. Do you believe that that is reciprocated in an authentic way?
Well, with the people who I've worked with, yes. With Mike Gallagher and Todd Young, yes. I mean, I think that on those issues, it has been. But the challenge has been that there are elements of the Republican Party, that don't recognize still Biden's legitimate election. You look at someone like J.D. Vance, right? I mean, he's someone who wrote Hillbilly Elegy. I didn't agree with all of it. It was a little bit too self-reliant in its message, but I thought it was a very solid book overall. I praised it. And he worked with Steve Case in Rise of the Rest to have economic development in communities that were left out. So I could see myself in a traditional way potentially having worked with him. But he's on television now talking about how we can't have Afghani refugees because if you're in a mall and you have an Afghani refugee, they may blow the whole mall up. So, how do you work with someone who's gone to that level of extreme in rhetoric. And that is the challenge, that there are elements of the Republican Party that have really taken the rhetoric to a whole different level in ways that contradict just the fundamental values of what it means to be American. It's not arguing over spending or how do we get something done or taxes. It's rejecting people based on their national origin or their religion. And that's something that I can't ever compromise on.
What's the future of the Republican Party? You have a figurehead in the former president who is we talk about social media and other forums, clearly someone who has quite a following. And you talk about J.D. Vance and folks that are the future in many respects. Can you speak to where you see the party going?
Well, I have been wrong about Donald Trump so many times that I'm probably not the best person to ask. I thought I got elected in 2016. My brother says it's the year anyone could have gotten elected because Trump got elected. But I was more confident in Hillary Clinton winning the election than I was in my own election. I didn't conceive that she would lose the election. And then I thought 2020 wasn't going to be as close as it turned out to be. And then I thought surely after January 6th, Donald Trump was done, that there was no future after 2 impeachments and after January 6th. But I've been wrong 3 times. Look, Donald Trump is stronger today in the Republican Party than he's ever been. And if I were to predict today, he'd be the nominee for the Republican Party unless something dramatically changes. So, I've learned my lesson, which is that we should not underestimate him or the hold he has on that party.
How does that comport with the larger vision we've spoken about today, where we have an opportunity to bring opportunity to so many areas of the country via digital opportunity, as you speak about, that have been marginalized? Is that separate, these political and social issues, from the economic progress that you speak about, or is it all interwoven and with a person like Trump or leaders like Trump impossible to achieve?
Well, one of the things we can do is acknowledge that the 2016 election was a wake-up call to the political class, that it was in part about jobs having left, communities having been desolated, main streets being emptied out, people talking about a brain drain in certain communities you go to, and a real sense that people are upset and they don't feel included in an economic vision. And then we could say, well, look, Donald Trump's saying that his solution to this is to stop Mexicans from coming into America and to blast off against the Chinese tariffs. But did that really rebuild Galesburg, Illinois? Did that really bring manufacturing back? President Biden, Intel is investing $20 billion in Ohio that's revitalizing the entire state. 7,000 manufacturing jobs, 3,000 construction jobs. Our messaging needs work. I mean, if Donald Trump had gotten $20 billion into Ohio, the whole country would think he single-handedly revitalized the Midwest. And yet not enough people know about what we're doing. But I guess I would start by saying that the acknowledging people's fears, acknowledging people's anger, understanding that some of that anger is legitimate, and then arguing on the plane of who's going to have real better solutions to improve their lives, rather than just starting off with a dismissal of people who voted for Trump, which I just don't think is ever going to win over many people who we can win over.
Another question from the audience. Representative, digital technology is a wonderful tool used for education, work, and employment. However, with smartphones, it seems to be used for gossip, and now lots of creative ways to gamble your money. How do we increase the first, positive, and decrease the second, negative?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are the balancing issues that we need. I mean, it's similar to the analogy of the printing press. It was used initially for pamphlets that were basically gossip and spreading rumors and lies. And then we started to figure out how do we use it for more thoughtful means as well. I think with technology, there has to be a balance. I mean, I'm way too addicted to my phone, and I put my phone down usually when I'm interacting with my family, or if I'm in a meeting, I never pick it up. I think every one of us has to keep our own boundaries on what that is, where technology is appropriate, where it's not appropriate. One of the places I think it doesn't work is in lots of education settings. I don't think you can just have the same experience zooming in to a classroom as you can being physically present in a classroom. And yet there are ways, probably technology can augment the educational experience by giving people access to supplemental courses or materials. So I think, and the people who are experts in the education field, but I think it's for them to figure out what is, and for all of us, what is this balance? Where should we use technology? Where is it appropriate not to use technology? And how do we do it in ways that are enhancing and not just addictive?
Well, the audience has really put some thought into these questions, and this one here is a good one. Which nation do you believe has, and it's multi-part, so
Wow.
I'll start. Which nation do you believe has handled deindustrialization well? What industrial policy did they follow, which our country can learn from? And lastly, what can we learn from countries like Japan, where industrial policy has largely failed? And I think maybe the spin I would put on this question, Michael Porter at, a longtime Harvard,
Yeah.
Business School, Porter's Five Forces, writes about innovation clusters, right? And looking at those areas of the world, Silicon Valley, obviously, where they have been able to build ecosystems that drive innovation and economic output and, hopefully equity as well. Where do you see that being done well?
Of course, we did it well with Hamilton and FDR, right? We created the industrial base in America, and I think other people have copied that model, which is industry working with labor and government and universities. In South Korea, the research shows that they've done it very well over 20, 30 years in creating leading technology industries. Taiwan, semiconductor manufacturing, other technology industries. Germany, with both what they've done in high-wage manufacturing, but also in what they've done for the service workers and having more bargaining power, having higher wages. Now, I wouldn't just copy their models. I still think there's an extraordinary amount that our country gets right. There's a reason the most innovative companies happen to be in the United States and not in Europe or South Korea. There's a lot of risk-taking innovation. But when it comes to a policy that can reindustrialize, rebuild America, looking at South Korea or Germany and saying, look, they're doing what we did in post-World War II or in World War II is something that I think can be an inspiration.
I'm going to keep rapid firing. We have a lot to cover. This is from YouTube. We actually have several questions along the lines of political polarization. Congressman, how long do you see this era of polarization lasting? 2022, 2024? When does it end?
Wow, I wish I knew. But I think the 20s are going to be a hard decade for our country. I think I'm not sure the country is ready. I said that we weren't content with the Biden versus Trump in 2020. We really are just dying for another Biden versus Trump 2024 rematch. I just think the country isn't at a point where we're still looking to the future. And I think the 20s is going to be a very tough decade for us in figuring out how we navigate issues of identity, how we find commonality as Americans, how we deal with economic displacement. But what gives me hope is the next generation. And I think as we turn the corner at the decade, I think that you have a new generation that is hopeful about tackling big issues like climate, that doesn't see the same divisions along race and gender quite as acutely, not saying it goes away, that may be able to bring us closer to a vision of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. I don't think it will be stopped. And I say this when people get very, very down and they think about Donald Trump. And I say, when I was growing up, our family, I was born in Philadelphia in 1976, and my parents are immigrants from India. It was hard to get an appointment with a staff person as a member of Congress, who was a staff person to a member of Congress. I never would have dreamed that you'd have 4 Indian Americans in Congress, or that you'd have a Vietnamese American woman running for Secretary of State of Georgia. Trump can't stop the diversity that's oozing out of every small town, city, community across the country. That's, I think, the march of American progress that Frederick Douglass talked about in Composite Nation. But the pace of it, I don't know. The harm that people can do in the process of getting there, I don't know. What I do know is when we do get there, that will be America's crowning achievement, civilizational achievement to the world.
Is that issue, when you talk about multiculturalism, is the solution generational? Do you believe, I look at us about the same age and your role as a leader in DC with certain lived experiences, a different age profile than many. I look at myself, leading a large business group here in Silicon Valley and the way we speak about some of these issues. Do you think that this next generation of leaders is going to be able to solve this polarization? We've grown up, my father's born and raised in the segregated South. My mom is a Caribbean immigrant, West Indian from Trinidad and Tobago, and my lived experience is very different than people and generations that preceded me. So are so many people that we've grown up with. So is the answer to this question that it's a generation away, given the multiculturalism we have seen in today's society, or is it deeper than that?
I think it's deeper than that, although I think the new generation offers hope and promise based on our lived experiences. I was joking with someone, I hope the baby boomers don't take this the wrong way. I said, how many presidents do you want in your generation? You're not even the greatest generation. It's how many will be enough or something. But at some point, I think that the new generation is, especially the young folks who are so passionate, focused on issues of climate, on issues of building the economy. I think that we will get there, but it won't be without work. It won't be without engagement, and it certainly won't come for granted.
Another question for you. This is from the audience. When will the FDR, Roosevelt voices in the Democratic Party, get a chance to speak out again?
Well, I co-chaired Senator Sanders' campaign, and I always used to say, that you're really an FDR Democrat, not a democratic socialist. I call myself a progressive capitalist. I tried to get him to talk about FDR, because I think FDR, even his famous speeches about the right to work and the right to a job was a right to a job not just in the public sector, but the private sector. And FDR mobilized the public sector, the private sector, and communities to build modern America. Now, he had the opportunity to do that. Partly he was a great leader, but partly he faced World War II and he faced a Great Depression, and so there was a moment of national purpose. And I think the challenge for leaders today is, well, how do you create that sense of national purpose to get people to move towards those policies? The pandemic, I thought, provided one of those moments, and we've done the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill. We could do more. It's in probably a bit of a missed opportunity, though we've done a lot. But that is the challenge. But I do think that there's more of a recognition that just leaving the markets to themselves to work things out with globalization hasn't been correct, both domestically in terms of the hollowing out of the middle class, and in places like China, where the theory that free markets would lead to democracy hasn't quite worked out.
So you wrote a book that I think is a fascinating book. What do you hope that audience members, people who pick up your book, will take away from it? And I hope folks go out and get the book. We're not trying to give anything away here, but what do you want the reader to take away from your book?
A hope about the ability to have an economic revitalization in this country. I hope that past leaders have overcome much worse odds, like Frederick Douglass. I end the book with this speech because I'm so moved by how this person who was enslaved for so many years in 1869 is defending Chinese immigrants coming to the United States and saying America is on the ascent. America is going to become this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. I mean, imagine being enslaved and then having that hope for America. So many people have had that hope, and I think it is so within our grasp to have an economic revitalization in this country to build into this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. I'm not convinced that everything in the book is, the way it has to be, but if it can start a conversation about what we need to do to have economic revitalization for people in places left out, and how we can start to build a collective purpose of what a multiracial, multi-ethnic American democracy looks like, that would be my hope.
Well, I'm trying to land this plane. I know we've got 5 minutes left, but we keep getting more questions. This is from YouTube, so I'm going to rapid fire in 5 minutes. Why hasn't the Democratic Party heavily, in caps, invested in a mega public relations or education campaign about the core mission and focus for the working class? This is what you touch on in your book.
Well, there has been a disconnect, I think, with some of our policies. I think the policies were too neglectful of jobs going offshore, of production going offshore, and I don't think it was intentional. I just think we didn't quite see for years how much devastation was taking place, how much wealth inequality was increasing, and how much people were being deprived of their hope and aspiration that they or their kids would have a better life. There has now been a correction of that. I think President Biden represents that, and the future of the party represents that, but it's going to take time to earn back people's trust. And some of that, I think, is why I invoke Bobby Kennedy. Some of that is doing things in local communities, one community at a time. So it's not just here is what Ro Khanna is saying or writing about. It's here is what Intel is doing to invest in Columbus, Ohio, to create X number of jobs, and now people are seeing it with validators who aren't politicians. The more we have that, the more I think we will rebuild trust with the working class that has reason to be angry about what has happened.
I think what's so interesting about that example is you have the private sector making a significant investment that is going to change the lives of many people probably across the state, not just in that community. And it's being done not at the behest of a government or not at the behest of a regulatory action, but it's being done because of an economic and I'm sure motives that are positive there for that region. Do you see more examples like that happening in the years to come?
I do. I mean, I think Pat Gelsinger at Intel will tell you that one of the reasons he was able to do that is in anticipation of the CHIPS Act, which is part of this COMPETES bill, because he was able to go to his board and say, there are billions of dollars of federal support for being able to build plants in America. And that, in my view, is leveling the playing field because other countries are providing that kind of support. So that's an example of a public-private partnership with local leadership that's bipartisan. I give the governor of Ohio, who's a Republican, credit on that issue. That's worked. And that if you go there, people are talking about a new patriotism, a new revitalization. And you can see a lot more of that, I think, with the COMPETES Act, encouraging that kind of reinvestment across the country. But it doesn't just have to be semiconductors. Steel plants. If you want to do offshore wind, it's going to take 5-inch thick steel. We don't make that in America. Why don't we? Why can't we have the government invest in plants with the private sector to be making steel in this country? Why can't we have Mary Barra at GM say, if you're going to reopen a plant in Lordstown, Ohio, that's going to make electric SUVs in a plant you closed, the government will purchase some of those first plants to make it economically viable. We have to be imaginative in how we can have the government partner with the private sector, partner with local community leaders to have that kind of innovation. One of the big disservices that has been done is the running down of government, the sense that government doesn't know what they're doing. Well, you can't believe that and believe at the same time that we have the greatest military in the world, which we do, which is largely government function, or that the internet, which was created at DARPA, was somehow not important. That was a government creation. Or that going to the moon was unsuccessful. That was the government. Or the fact that the GPS was invented. That was the government. But there is such skepticism today of the government, the delegitimization of the government. And that is a real disservice, because America works best when we have the public sector working with the private sector, working with educational institutions, working with local community leaders, all on the same team. And that's what we have to get back to.
Well, a fascinating conversation, and I have one last question. It'll give you a chance to make some news if you want. And actually, we got multiple questions online about this.
Yeah.
I'll just read this one to you.
Okay.
There has been talk about your future political aspirations. What is next for Ro Khanna? Are you running for president?
No, I mean, I think Donald Trump will be the nominee of the Republican Party. And I think we have to do everything possible to make this president a success and to have him prevail over Donald Trump. Post-Trump, there will be plenty of time to think about the future. But Trump represents a major, major threat to the vision. And right now, I fundamentally believe that Biden is the best person to beat him. If not, there will be others who I would get behind. But my single criteria will be who can defeat Donald Trump in 2024, and I'll be supporting that person. And right now, I think it's the president.
Well, thank you very much, Ro, for such an insightful conversation. It gives me such joy to have a civil conversation with leaders in D.C. like yourself that are committed to doing the right thing, having such a great engaged audience. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for the great list of questions. I did my best to get to as many of them as I could, and a shout out to everyone on YouTube listening in. For those who are interested in more Commonwealth Club programs in the weeks and months ahead, www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club, and again, thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Ahmad. Really enjoyed it.